All right, well, thank you all for joining us for the Essentials of Lab Management workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Dave Hatchett, Vice President, Executive Director of Research Infrastructure, and Professor. They're going to discuss overall laboratory management, strategies, and much more. And without further ado, I'll now hand it over to Dr. Hatchett to get us started.
Well, thank you for the opportunity and good morning to everybody. So I, in fact, am a 25-year veteran of UNLV, and I built a lab here, and I've had postdocs in my lab, and I also was a postdoc at Georgia Tech before coming here. So I think I have a unique perspective on, the essentials of laboratory management because I've done it for quite a while. So the way I formatted this was to kind of go through, defining what a postdoc is and really what you're going to be expected to know if you are managing a lab. But also I think it's important to ask, what do you get out of it? Because as much as anything else, a postdoc is about furthering your career and advancing your knowledge. So I'm a firm believer. If you have questions, please ask. This is meant to be a give and take. So I'll get started. I don't have a lot of slides. I fully expect that we should have some discussion about different topics. So I'll leave it at that and get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is, what is a postdoc? In your mind, you probably have an idea. A postdoc is this. It will get me these things. I will be doing, certain things associated with being a postdoc. But in reality, postdocs are about, a person who has obtained their PhD, and you become a free agent and you work for another professor, and the expectations are you bring your knowledge that you derive from your PhD to that laboratory and apply it, and you learn new things from that. So it could be that you learn professional skills. It could be that you learn how to build a lab. It could be you manage students, but the understanding is that you're going to bring your expertise to that organization and utilize it as the PI needs to advance his laboratory. So it could be that you are expected to write proposals and come up with ideas, but ultimately the PI is responsible for that and will define your job as a postdoc. So I always like to start with what should you get from a postdoc? And what I mean when I ask that question is not what they get from you, but what you get from being a postdoc. So when you talk about research experience and skills, and when I talk about research, I want to be clear. I'm not just talking about STEM. Research is a broad, vast array of different disciplines that may or may not be STEM. So I don't want to pigeonhole this and say we're only talking about STEM. Social science is research, and there are laboratories, health research. There's a variety of different possibilities, that a postdoc will encounter in terms of discipline specific research. So from that standpoint, what should you get from it? You should get research experience and skills that you don't have, meaning you bring to the table a set of skills. But if you're not diversifying what you know as a postdoc, then you're not really gaining something valuable from that. Publications, meaning if you do a postdoc, the first thing people are going to ask is, what did you produce during your postdoc? And as much as you can say, well, I helped set up a lab and I helped, teach graduate students and mentor them, they're going to want to know, what did you produce? And publications are the example of that. What you may not have thought of, but it certainly is something you should get. You should learn how to write a grant. If you don't learn how to write a grant during a postdoc, then you've lost out on a valuable tool. Because in the end, if you're using a postdoc to advance to academia, there is an expectation that you will be writing, proposals and grants. So the other thing I think is really critical that we talk about is independence and leadership development, meaning as a graduate student, you may not be the leader in the lab. As a postdoc, you will be the leader in the lab. There is an expectation of your leadership coming to the forefront, and that you are independent, meaning that your PI does not expect to have to tell you what to do on a daily basis, that they provide you with a construct or guidelines, but where you go with it and how you manage that is yours to do. So management, you will manage projects, you will supervise students, and you will mentor PhD students. So you have to learn mentorship skills. Let's just be honest. And everybody knows a bad mentor when they have one. So are you going to be a good mentor or a bad mentor? And what skills do you need to do that? Teaching opportunities. If you want to be in academia, then this is an opportunity for you to negotiate teaching. I taught it as part of my postdoc. It wasn't originally what was, you know, provided to me, but I negotiated it with my advisor, and eventually I ended up teaching classes, which lets you know either yes, I really like that, or no, I don't like that. But the reality is you're going to be teaching in the lab. Do you want to teach in a classroom, and is that opportunity available? So the third thing I'll bring up is career development. Postdocs, you should be giving talks, presentations, and networking. You should be building relationships outside of your PI, because when you leave, those are going to be critical in terms of networking and having people who know who you are to help further your career. Again, I bring up independence. You have to establish independent research. So as part of your postdoc, you should be thinking about, if you want to go in, if you want to be a professor at some point, you should be thinking about what is, from what I'm doing, what and what in my previous experience, what can I develop that is my own independent research? And then you think about that as you go. Now, I was very lucky in my postdoc. I established a research area that my mentor was not working in, and he basically said, the only thing I'm interested in is this piece. You can take the rest. So I ended up being able to take a large amount of work with me to develop my own future academic research. So that is always a possibility, but you need to be upfront with your PI, and you need to have those discussions. So prepare for the job market is the last thing I'll bring up, and that is you need to build a CV that is representative of what you need to advance in whatever area you're looking for. Meaning an academic CV is different than an industry CV or a government position where you're giving somebody a CV. Know your audience and develop your CV accordingly. So I'm sure that those are topics that were discussed in previous presentations, but I think they're critical. So continuing, what should you get from a postdoc? Funding and fellowship opportunities are critical. So you can apply for fellowships, you can secure your own funding, and you can support independent research, provided you get the okay from your mentor. Meaning what you don't want to be doing is this behind the scenes. You want to be doing this in a transparent nature, so your boss knows that this is an interest of you. He or she may say, no, that's not really the way I see it. And in that case, just keep those things ready for when you move to your next appointment. Professional growth, you should have skill building as part of your postdoc. So Communication, writing, public speaking, and overall collaboration with other people are skills that you should develop. And finally, career mentorship. Your advisor should provide you with mentorship. And you can talk to his students and his or her students, and you can find out what kind of boss are you going to get. Meaning, do not be, don't just assume they're going to be good mentors. Find out, look at their history, talk to people. Your career path, and I pulled this off the internet. Your career paths, you start out as, getting your bachelor's degree. You may go through a master's, you may go straight to a PhD, but then you get to this postdoc position. And I'm going to tell you, you're going to work harder than you've ever worked. I put in, I think, 60-hour weeks, not because they were required, but because I knew that it was in my best interest to put that kind of time in. And then if you transition to a PI or a professor, that's one path, but it doesn't have to be the path. You could go into industry, you can go into, governmental agencies. There's a lot of pathways. So build your postdoc to help develop the pathway that you want. All right. So functions of a postdoc in general. Number one, research, research, research. The reason you're being hired, the reason you are walking through that door is whoever is hiring you has decided your background is going to be beneficial to them to conduct their research. That does not mean that you have to simply do their research, but you need to be transparent, and you need to talk to your PI about what your expectations are, not just their expectations with respect to research. You should expect to write publications and give presentations. You should go to conferences, right? When you're at conferences, don't hide in the hotel, go to other talks, learn new things, talk with people, ask questions, engage with the people doing work like you. Write grant proposals. Don't wait for your PI to say, hey, I want you to write this grant. If you think there are grants that you could go after that would benefit what you are doing in the lab, ask your mentor if you can apply for those and write those grants. Mentorship, you will mentor students. In fact, in my lab, if you're a postdoc, you will have a minimum of 2 to 3 undergraduates and 1 to 2 graduate students working with you on a defined project. And you're expected to mentor them and help move them along in their journey. Some things you don't think about: equipment upkeep and it should say maintenance, because you're going to be the lab manager, whether you like that term or not. Whether you prefer postdoc, it's postdoc / lab manager. Whatever laboratory you're working in, if it has instrumentation, you're going to be expected to keep it up. And you're going to be expected to make sure it's working properly so that the team members can use it to advance their research. Collaboration, team building, networking. The reality is that research is moving into how do we solve complex problems with teams. So you will need to collaborate. You will need to be part of a team. You will need to network to find people who have expertise that you're lacking in a given project. All of those things are necessary. Okay. New skills method development. You may come into a lab that's just starting a project, and you're going to be expected to develop the standard operating procedures. You're going to be expected to identify the methods, and you're going to be expected to teach everybody in the lab how to do that. So it is not simply a passive, engagement. It's active. and you're expected to transfer knowledge. Data analysis, management, interpretation. If you read any proposal for, whether it's NIH, NSF, or any other federal agency, you will see data is moving to open access. Now, if it has intellectual property associated with it, then not necessarily, but eventually you will find that you are responsible for doing all the data analysis, managing how it's stored, its interpretation, and whether or not it is shared with the public. So those are all part of proposals. And if you don't address those things, you don't get funded anymore. And the very last thing I put, and I put it last because this is really what we're here to talk about, is lab management and all the skills that it takes to manage a lab effectively. I'm going to be honest with you, labs aren't just in academia. Labs can be research institutions, industry, national laboratories. A variety of different laboratories exist. So your postdoc may be in any one of these areas, but there are actual skills that you must have to manage a laboratory, whether it's STEM or non-STEM is really not relevant here. The skills that you need are going to be pretty consistent across the board. So what are they? So the first thing I'm going to say is you as the lab manager are responsible for all the organization, the inventory, and space management, meaning you have multiple people who have to use the lab, you have multiple projects, you have, consumables for, STEM labs, you have, data recording devices for other situations, all of those things, all of their organization and the inventory you have available have to be managed. And then you have to manage space because people need space to work. So do you have enough space for everybody to do what they need? And I'm going to tell you, rarely do people think they have enough space. So if you're in a chemistry lab, I guarantee there will be somebody who encroaches on your space, wants to use your stuff, and there will be squabbling over whose space it is and who should be using it at a given time. It's pretty common. So you have to be ready for that. Safety. So when I talk about safety, and I mean this, this is one of the things I stress in my laboratory. Safety is critical. If you believe you're being asked to do something that's unsafe in research, you say no, and you have the right to say no. That being said, if you feel it's unsafe, how do you make it safe, right? So that is standard operating procedures. It's basically developing safety protocols to ensure everybody that comes in the lab is properly trained and knows how to use the tools of the lab in a safe manner. So tools could be chemicals, tools could be tools, equipment, etc. But you need to ensure the safety of the lab. Data management we talked about, so I won't go into that, but you are really going to be responsible for all the data management. You're going to be responsible for leading the teams and helping build the cohesion of the teams to make sure they meet deliverables. You're going to have to manage resources. When I say resources, I'm not just talking about the inventory and the tools that are necessary for people. I'm actually talking about the dollars, because how you manage the lab, whether you do so in an efficient or inefficient manner, makes a difference in how much money it costs to operate that lab. So you are ultimately responsible for the day-to-day resource management of the laboratory. And believe me, if your boss sees things getting broken or a lot of money being spent on things that he or she thinks are frivolous, you will be the first one to be contacted to answer for the resource management. Number 6 is, and I said this previously, but I'm highlighting it here, equipment upkeep and maintenance. You will have multiple people using the same piece of instrumentation or tools, and you have to keep them up and make sure they are functional. Research project oversight and management, you could have as a postdoc multiple research projects you are responsible for, and you might have to manage the teams for all of those. You have to decide, can I do that? Is it effective? Am I effective, or do I have too much on my plate? Because if you get too much, then some of the projects are going to suffer. So you have to be straightforward, and you have to be honest with your PI to say, no, that's all I can do. This is, I'm doing as much as I can. This needs to be managed by somebody else. If your mentor is a good mentor, they will understand that, and they will work out and listen to you. So not last thing, but something that I think is critical, that I think is often overlooked, and that is a lab culture and tone. Meaning, I'm not going to say I've liked working with every person I've had to work with, and I think every one of us can say something very similar. That being said, I don't have to. What I have to do is be respectful of people, and I have to develop a lab culture and tone that is inclusive, that makes sure everybody feels they can do what they need to be successful. So if you are the person who is responsible for that, how do you deal with those people who are not um, inclusive? How do you deal with people who are problems when it comes to the team? So you will have to deal with, conflict, whether you like it or not, because you will be responsible for the culture and tone of the laboratory. Number 9 is a huge thing that you'll see in the news over and over today, and that's ethics, compliance, and responsible conduct of research. So in the last, I would say, 5 years, we've seen a dramatic shift in people's record being reevaluated for ethics, compliance, and responsible conduct of research. So you can look up, there are multiple faculty members from a variety of institutions whose basically research record has been reevaluated, and it's been shown that they falsified data, plagiarized, right? We see this all the time now because we see people who have been caught plagiarizing. This is not going away. Research records are records, and now that everything's becoming digitized, right? It's easy to go back and scrutinize somebody's record. That being said, that is important for you as a lab manager, in that you need to set the tone again, and you need to ensure that people in your lab work ethically, that they work within the compliance that is required. So if it's an IRB related protocol, so human subjects, animals, there are definitely rules and regulations for you to be compliant with the use and research in those areas. So you have to be knowledgeable of that as the lab manager. The last essential tool, what I would say is skill, is professional development mentorship. And that's both for you and for your mentees, the people that you are overseeing in the lab. You need to help their professional develop, you need to help mentor them, but likewise, you as the lab manager need that mentorship from your PI. Nobody, when they first enter a laboratory, is going to have all the skills necessary to manage a laboratory. There's going to have to be some teaching. And by the way, your PI is going to have a clear opinion about how the lab should be managed. So you have to work that out with them. So that is part of your professional development. So if you notice, 1, 2, 6, and 7 are what I call hard lab skills. Those are things that you are doing in the lab with people on a likely a daily basis. The other things are what I call soft lab skills. So they may not be every day, um, but they're going to come into your management of a laboratory, whether you like those things or not. They're going to be part of your job. So when you look at all of this and you say, okay, I want to be a postdoc, the question I would say you have to ask is, what do you get out of the experience? Now, I say that tongue in cheek in that you may not know, but you have to ask yourself, why am I doing a postdoc? What is the end goal? What do I want from it? Is kind of the point I'm trying to make. So what do you want to learn or develop using this experience? You should go into a postdoc saying, when I come out of this experience, I should get these benefits from it. I took a postdoc with a professor at Georgia Tech who was new to the institution, knowing full well I would have to set up his lab. And when I mean set up his lab, I mean I had to buy everything that went into it. I had to set it up. I had to work with graduate students to get them started. But what did that do for me? When I left there wanting to be a professor, I already knew how to set up a lab. So when I got here, it was not a problem. So I wanted those skills and I specifically looked for them. All right. So let's talk about the essentials, and I'm breaking it down, all of them that we went through. So when we talk about organization, inventory, and space management, I mean, the questions you have to ask is, do you have the needed supplies to do what you have to do? Is there proper space and storage so that we can safely do what we need to do? And do you have adequate clean space to do their work? So you will hear hygiene, the term hygiene. And when we think hygiene, we think of personal hygiene, right? But laboratory hygiene is a term. And what it says is, do I have a clean lab or do I have a dirty lab? Right? Do I let people into my lab with food? Do I not? Right? Do I expect that people will clean up their own space, or do I clean up for them? And I'm going to tell you, you're going to, if you have kids or you're going to have kids, you will learn really quick. It's better to teach them to clean up after themselves than always clean up after them. The same applies to labs. You will, if you clean up after them, you will clean up after them for the entirety of their stay in that laboratory. That is not your job. That is a waste of your time. It's better to teach them proper lab organization and skills so that they basically do their job cleanly. Okay. So the next one, safety, SOPs, protocols, don't taste or sniff chemicals. Anybody ever heard that? Don't eat or drink in the lab. Dispose of waste properly. Don't play mad scientist, right? I mean, all of these are kind of, cartoon caricatures, but the reality is I can tell you of an example at Texas Tech where a student, graduate student, was running experiments with explosive materials, and he was supposed to make 50 milligrams and he made 50 grams, and it went kaboom and took off 3 of his fingers, and the lab got shut down. So you have to, as the postdoc, be very aware of what experiments are being run, what is the safety precautions necessary to use those materials. There are materials that are, for example, pyrophoric. They will ignite in air, right? So do you have the safety protocols in place to use that material safety? Safety compliance, regardless of what type of lab you are in, is critical. And the way you know that is there is occupational safety health, right? OSHA. And what do? They go into businesses, laboratories, etc., and they determine, is it a safe working environment? So safety compliance is critical, and you can be fined, you can be shut down. PPE, which is what? Does anybody know what PPE is? We shouldn't use acronyms. It's basically protective, your protective um, things that you wear in the laboratory. So it could be safety goggles, it could be a lab coat, it could be gloves, etc. What do you need for safe lab operation? And finally, training protocols to identify hazards and how to use them in experiments safely. So you should have in a given lab what I call an SOP manual. So you know, standard operating procedures for a given hazard that you train the people in your care to utilize so that they do things safely. So it literally comes down to, you are responsible. You have to set up the proper safety guidelines, and you have to do the training. So all of those things end up being your responsibility as a laboratory manager. So data management, best practices for data management. And this is one of those things, if you're using notebooks, is it better to have an electronic notebook or a hard copy? What are your standards? Do you require somebody to sign off that they've observed that you have done what you have said? How do you store data? How do you back it up? How do you manage it on a day-to-day? What is your plan for managing data? Right? Is it everybody's on their own and you have your external hard drive that you drag around to every computer to pull your data off of, or is there cloud possibilities? But you also have to think about, what software do you require for them to work up their data? Because you're not going to be the one who works up all of the data. You're going to have graduate students who are working under you that are collecting their own data, and they're going to have to work it up, analyze it for their dissertation. So then it comes down to, is it open access, or do you have intellectual property? You as the lab manager are the gatekeeper. You're the one who is going to have to implement what your PI wants in those regards. So you have to have a plan. All right, professional development and mentorship. So how do you manage a team if you've never done so before? This is something you're going to have to learn. How do you articulate goals and responsibilities to the team? More importantly, if I say these are your goals and responsibilities and you don't do them, what's the consequences for team members not doing their job? Because what I'm going to tell you is, if you have a team of multiple people and one person doesn't do their job and your expectation is everybody else picks up that slack, there will be resentment very quickly of that one person who gets the pass while the other ones do all the work. So it is not a trivial thing. You have to manage those expectations. So you have to provide mentorship and guidance to all of the people in the lab. And everybody in the lab is an individual. So what you provide them will be different. So that in itself is a complex thing. Hold regular meetings for research exchange. The people in your lab shouldn't have to guess what other people are doing. They should be in regular meetings where they see what others are doing, and they can build off of those ideas, and they can have constructive conversations about what's being done. And then you need to think about, what do you provide in terms of skill development and training based on the expertise that you expect them to develop during their tenure in the lab, and also based on your expectations and what you expect to develop over that time. So all of those are relevant. Resource management, budgeting, purchasing, invoicing, reconciling grants with expenditures, minimizing waste. and writing grants to obtain new resources. So there is this cycle, and it is, we can perform research because there's money coming through the door, and we are expected to spend that money within a given period of time defined by the funding agency. Once that period of time is up, if we haven't done what we need to do or spent all the money, it is not necessarily available to us after that point. So you have to manage all of that as the lab manager. You have to make sure that what's needed to get the research done to provide the deliverables for the statement of work that the grant funds happens. And that means all of the people have to be aligned with that. So you end up having to make sure that each group is doing what they need to do based on the funding that they have for that project. And it's not simply okay to take money from one project and fund another. That's not okay. That your funding agency would frown upon that, guaranteed. So you have to manage it within the structure of deliverables provided by the funding agency, and you can't just move money. It's not a slush fund. So that becomes, it becomes a task that you have to pay attention to. Okay, equipment upkeep and maintenance. So some of you, this isn't going to apply to you, because if you're in a social science lab, or you're in a health lab, or other things where instrumentation isn't critical, then this doesn't apply. But those of you that are in laboratories that are doing, for example, analytical measurements, you're analyzing something to determine how much of a given substance, hold on, my light just turned off, sorry. You're going to have to do this, right? You're going to have to calibrate instruments. And what do I mean by calibrate? Well, I'll give you an example. My wife worked in a toxicology lab that did drug testing, and they had to make sure for every instrument, the protocol they had developed could actually measure what they said it was. So they had to take known standards of things like cocaine, methamphetamine, etc., run them using the protocol, right, at known concentration, quantitate it, and then they could run the unknowns to see, was it there and what was the concentration. Your experiments are only as good as the calibrations you make on that instrument. If you don't know that it's been calibrated or it hasn't been calibrated for a given period of time, you may not be making accurate measurements. And that falls on you as a lab manager to make sure that's happening. It could be something as simple as a balance, weighing out mass, and it's not been calibrated over time. So what do? You get the little weights that have known calibration, known mass, and you measure them. So that's how you'd calibrate. Regular maintenance. When I say by regular maintenance, I'm really talking about preventative maintenance. I'm assuming most of us drive cars, and most of us actually do change the oil when the car says, hey, stupid, change the oil, right? That's a preventative maintenance step so that you don't drive somewhere with really bad oil and seize your engine up. Guess what? The instruments in a lab, that thing might be a quarter of the size of your car, but it's 10 times more expensive. So if you think you can get away from preventative maintenance on an instrument that's $500,000, you're not going to be able to. And you know what? In some of those instruments, we change the oil. So you need to realize regular maintenance provides preventative maintenance. It keeps the instrument from catastrophically failing. You need to log time. You need to know how long it's been in use, because things that are consumables will get used. And you need to make sure that the people using it share the expenses. So if it's getting used by an outside group, but you're responsible for it, your PI is going to expect you to figure out what their cost is and make sure they share those expenses. The other thing you might be asked to do is procure a new instrument. So I was asked actually to go to Boston to buy a very specific instrument, and I toured 3 companies that made it in like 3 days. ran real samples, and I ended up purchasing basically a $1.5 million instrument. So your PI might decide we need a new instrument, and you're going to be tasked with finding that new instrument and testing it. So those are all possibilities. So research project oversight and management, again, know the timelines and deadlines, proposals, deliverables, and closeout, are all relevant in terms of timelines. You can apply for certain grants at a certain time. You can get awarded. It will be for a set period of time. There will be deliverables during that set period of time. And if you don't meet those deliverables, they can pull the grant. Or you get to the end of it and you have only spent 2/3 of it. So you end up having to give money back, which is not something your university or the VP of research would like to see you do. Okay, so you have to do task tracking and management. Will you meet the deliverables and deadlines based on the grant ending dates? Now you can always ask for an extension, a no cost extension. So that's one way. As a lab manager, you can say, okay, I know we're not going to meet the deliverables in the timeline. I need to go talk to my PI and I need to ask him for a no cost, that he requests a no cost extension. Most of the time, funding agencies, if you're making adequate progress, will give you a no cost extension. That happened extensively during COVID, right? Because through no fault of anybody's, labs were getting closed down. Rather than return all the money, they basically said, okay, we know this is going to be shut down and we will extend out the timeline. Okay, you have to do progress review. And when I say that, I'm talking about student progress and what are the milestones of the project. Are the students making adequate progress so that the project itself is meeting the milestones? Those are things that you will have to manage in a laboratory as a postdoc. All right, essentials of lab culture and tone, and really this comes down to a very simple thing. You as a communicator need to be transparent, and you need to set the expectations for your teams and your collaborator based on that. You need to understand history, documentation of lab processes and procedures that are aligned with what results you expect. And you need to do conflict resolution and problem solving. And what I'm going to tell you is something I've learned during my career. Procrastination, because you don't want to deal with it, is bad news. It causes uncertainty and animosity, and it might take a really tiny problem and explode it into a very large problem in the lab that you didn't have to have. So don't procrastinate through this. It's incredibly important that you deal with conflicts and problems as they happen. Do you have to have the solution to start dealing with it? No, you do not. But you can't just bury your head in the sand and say, well, I hope it goes away, because it will not go away. And when it doesn't go away, it's going to explode into something much larger. And you don't want that. All right. We're almost done with all of these, but so essentials of one of the essentials that you will find is ethics, compliance, and responsible conduct of research are front and center in anything that we do now. So when you think of what are the ethical considerations, when it comes to human subject research, informed consent, balancing risks, benefits, right? Scientific integrity, right? Animal research and the ethics associated with that, privacy and confidentiality, right? Dual use research, meaning, am I using the same data to write 20 publications, or am I using the same data to write 2 similar proposals, but checking the box saying, no, I'm not shopping this elsewhere? Okay. What are the global perspectives that impact ethics, compliance, and responsible conduct of research? And what are the case studies that tell you you are doing what you are doing ethically? All right. All of these things are things that you have to be concerned about as laboratory manager. And what I'll tell you is people who are bad actors, and whether you like it or not, and it's not always obvious. But when it happens, you will know. So what you have to do is set the tone again in terms of what are the ethics, what are your expectation. You know, you have to define, how do you respect human participants, animals, right? What is confidentiality and privacy in your laboratory, etc. Then you have compliance, meaning for us to have certain grants on this campus, we have to adhere to the regulations. So that could be IRB when it comes to human subject, IACUC when it's animal research, but also things like data privacy when you talk about the med school, dental school, and others where you have HIPAA compliance, right? We can't talk about your medical records. And so we have to be concerned that we maintain confidentiality, which is part of the compliance and regulation side of the house. And finally, RCR, which is really, it's research integrity. It's trying to minimize research misconduct, so fabrication, falsification, plagiarism. But it's also about how do you mentor people, responsibly, and how do you deal with collaboration. When I say collaboration, is what I mean by that is if I'm the postdoc and I collect all the data and I write the first manuscript, does that entitle me to be the first author or not? These are things you shouldn't leave open-ended for discussion. These are things you should have as you walk through the door beginning your postdoc. What am I going to get credit for versus what are you taking credit for? And is there respect, mutual respect for my contribution? Okay. So those are all things that are becoming, I think, more and more front and center in terms of you see examples of, ethical, conundrums where people have done things that they really shouldn't have and they get caught. So the last one, professional development and mentorship. And again, what I mean by this is when all's said and done, and you have managed a laboratory for typically a postdoc is 2 years, what do you get out of the experience? And I asked this up front. What did you want to learn or develop through this experience? So it could be skills that you didn't have when you walked through the door. It could be grant writing, technical communication, networking, leadership, training, ethics and compliance, an understanding of different things that you initially did not understand. But more importantly, things like, how do you guide? How do you support? What do you need to be guided and supported? Independent ideas, right? What kind of feedback do you expect, right? And are you receptive to feedback? I mean, one of the things that we tend to be our own worst critic, but we don't like people to criticize us. The reality is your mentor could be a asset to your career development. But if you don't tell them what you want and what you need, you're not going to get it just because you hope. So you have to define those things. So when I say of all the things you do, there is a selfish component of laboratory management, and that is what are you getting from it? What are you expecting from it? And is it going to further your career? That is a critical thing. So I'll summarize and then I'll be happy to take any questions you guys have. What does a successful understanding of a laboratory management, what does it essentially provide you? I put down these 5 things. It could be more than that, but I think these are the takeaways that I think are important. We talk about leadership, but this is an opportunity to develop leadership skills. And it's something that you should develop anyway, but leadership skills, for project coordination and resource management. Those are, not everybody has those skills, right? And you could develop them in managing a laboratory. Effective supervision of research teams, projects, and outcomes. Again, not everybody has that skill set. So are you able to do that when you leave your postdoc? Organizational skills. You have to be able to organize teams, etc., resources, teams, all of the pieces required to ensure the outcomes and deliverables. So it becomes much larger than just one thing. Effective communication, writing, and grantsmanship for future research projects. At the end of your postdoc, you should say to yourself, I can write a paper, and I think I can write a research proposal using my own ideas. Those are critical. And what that really ties into is you have to develop independent thoughts, abilities, and ideas that help build your career. Okay, not somebody else's, your career. So with that, I will take any questions you have.
And feel free to
Um,
unmute your mic if you'd like. We did have one, but it looks like it disappeared from the chat. It was asking, what do you view as appropriate consequences for the workplace
in
in the
terms
lab?
of like conflict.
Or I guess
So,
not getting the jobs done, the tasks done.
so I think you have to be honest and you have to evaluate, can they do it? You have to give them guidance and you know, my expectations are always that I'm going to ask you what don't you understand so that you will ask me questions or tell me what you're missing, and then we can have a conversation on how to move forward. And I'll do that a couple times, right? Minimum, if somebody's having trouble getting up and over a barrier that's there. But eventually you have to ask, you know, if they can't get to that point, is this the right position for them? Should they be leading that portion? Probably not. So you have to be honest and you have to tell them, my expectations are that you will do X, Y, and Z. If that doesn't happen, then you have to take action. Because remember, if you don't take action, your PI is going to see a lack of progress and you're going to be the one responsible. So that it depends on how a lab functions, but in most of the labs I've worked in, the postdoc is, you know, he's the quarterback, she's the quarterback, you know, they run the lab. So if there's deficiencies in the lab, they take the brunt of the criticism.
All right, well, before we end today's session, we'd like to thank our presenter, Dr. Hatchett, for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. But before y'all log off, please take a few minutes to fill out this workshop feedback survey that I just dropped in the chat. It's a real great way for us to receive feedback on our workshops to see how we can improve them and future programming as well. And if there's no other questions, then we can go ahead and conclude today's workshop. Thank you so much, Dr. Hatchett.
Thank you.